of the Northwest, Professor Job Mokgoro, is a man that is well exposed to the world of teaching. I received his CV. It's a lengthy CV, but for today's purposes, I think it's all about his academic training, his academic education, his contribution academically. And the most important part of his academic teaching is that he has taught on many universities in his capacity as a well-trained and well-versed administrator of government affairs, of government management. And as you know, today's lecture is about strategic planning, and in the handbook, which, Premier, I'm going to give away the secret, you will receive a gift, the handbook that the class is using. For purposes of everybody listening and the media, this is rated at R0, so you don't have to declare it. It's a desk copy with great appreciation to the local bookstore, which provided that. The places that I just would like to mention where Job Mokgoro has in the past been involved was at WITS, School for Public Development and Management, also at Fort Hare, 2004 to 2007. He has been a consultant doing a lot of work right over the African continent. After he was the administrator for the old Bophuthatswana converting into the Northwest government, he was actually part of the architecture of this province that we have here today, and he spent the first 2 terms as the DG of the province when Premier Popo Molefe was Premier in the province. And at that stage, we worked together from time to time. And his first degree is from Fort Hare, 1971. So he's from that very important background. And then he did a Bachelor in Administration, Honours, at the University of the Northwest, 1984. I think it was called Unibo at that stage.
Yes, it was.
But now we're all University of the Northwest, or the Northwest University to get that. Then he went to the USA. At the University of Toledo, he did a master's degree, and later on, as acknowledgement for all the work he did, he received an honorary doctorate from the University of Toledo as well. The other part of his interest, which I think is important for us, is that he takes the business of government very seriously. He has inherited, as the Premier over the last year or so, a huge challenge. And when I saw the chapter in the book, the difference between strategic planning in the private sector, which is what this book is about, there's definitely a difference when you apply this to the public service. And I requested him, and he humbly accepted, that he will talk to us about those differences and what the challenges are of managing strategically in the public service. Professor Mokgoro, it's my pleasure.
Thank you. Thank you very much. As I've been thinking about this lecture, I've been chopping and changing. Firstly, I think a lot of what we know about strategic planning, strategic management, in many instances, we borrowed this from the US Army. Not in all instances, but in many instances, we borrowed this from the US Army. And the corporate world started using those tools, adapting the tools. And later on, these tools that in a sense were tried and tested and perfected in the private sector were then transferred to the public sector, adapted to the public sector. So in other words, you're talking about a discipline that has been shifting. And I guess in many instances, one would expect that there would not be the kind of perfection that one would want to see, precisely because of this adjustment that you do. But having done that, I think it was the other day, where we read that the business confidence in our country had become the lowest since the Rubicon speech of the former PFV, Botha, president of South Africa then. So you say, okay, strategic planning, strategic management is a discipline that has moved from one context to the other. But at the same time, the context has become very vibrant, very fluid, oftentimes very chaotic, times very frustrating, and so forth and so on. And when you look at a number of academics in particular, with all apologies to academics, you find that in many instances we tend to assume a world of linear characteristics where mathematical models dominate, where you can use these models to do predictions and predictive validity and so forth and so on. And when you understand the paradigm that underpins this kind of thinking, then there is some kind of assumption that says the world today is going to be the same world tomorrow. And therefore, the tools of trade, the instruments of analysis that we use will be the same as we move forward. So these are the things that we will try to achieve today. And as we make every effort to achieve this, maybe we should remember one thing that Ronald Reagan said at one time. He says, you know, you and I would normally say, okay, I understand the theory of this, but does it really work in practice? On the contrary, Ronald Reagan said, if it works in practice, does it work in theory? Which I thought was quite a smart question to ask. Because the reality is, if one were to take an example such as golf, do you teach me laws of physics, laws of mathematics, in order for me to be the best golfer? Because there's a particular angle that is involved, excuse me, for me to hit the ball, and so on. Or do you allow me to hit the ball and perfect my ability to hit the ball, and then you make inferences around the theoretical constructs that might be explaining what I have just done, whether I've done it well or I've not done it well. So in grappling with this kind of difficult question, which is a question that I think we should always ask, not only to say if it works in theory, does it work in practice, but if it works in practice, does it work in theory. And I'm referring to this illustration because I'm not quite sure, being in an academic setting, whether the kind of facilitation or strategic management that one is doing here, whether it has to be theoretical, whether it has to be practical, whether it has to be both, and whichever way it is, to what extent would it be useful for those who are in the practicing world and those who are preparing to go into the practicing world. So again, a number of questions which do not have easy and straightforward answers. So let me zoom straight into the practical world of government, the practical world of the South African government, but which in many ways, about roughly 10 years ago, was borrowed from the broader global practical world. But you would know that at some stage in our democracy, government adopted the National Development Plan. And of course, the National Development Plan was a product of a comprehensive process of consultation. And I'm really mentioning the NDP to say, but where does strategy start in government? Now, for a long time, there has been concern that there was lack of long-term perspective planning in the culture of planning in our country, in particular in the public sector. Well, we have the NDP, whose time period goes up to 2030. But I think it could still be argued that, notwithstanding the fact that there is long-term perspective planning that might be inferred from the National Development Plan, one could still ask the question as to whether in practice do we see strategic planning that fits an approach called long-term perspective planning. Maybe, maybe not. But if you look at the dynamics of change and the vicissitudes in which we find ourselves, it does appear that much as there would be commitment in terms of long-term perspective planning, the reality is such that that becomes very, very, very difficult to sustain. Now, if you look at the planning system of government, you'll find that, as we all know, we've got three spheres of government. Now, it is very, very important that in strategic planning that we make every effort to ensure that the three talk to one another. So that if you look at the national perspective, the first thing that has to inform, broadly speaking, the strategic planning efforts is the National Development Plan. What are the goals that we see over a time horizon up to 2030? What are those? So how do we begin to plan given that particular context? Now, we also know that on a 5-year basis, every political party that is contesting elections would come up with what they call manifesto. They would say, if you elect me, if you elect my party, this is what we are going to offer. So they will give you that which they will be doing. And they're expected to do that within the context of the National Development Plan. So that will be stage 2, if you like, of strategic planning from this very broad framework. Then you have a particular party after the elections that wins the elections. So that particular party will be expected to come up with a perspective that says, over the next 5 years, this is what we are going to do. Remember, the manifesto talks to a political term. And as you and I know, a political term lasts for 5 years. So necessarily, the manifesto would be a translation into deliverables. Now, based on that, the party that would have won the election would, in the National Assembly, have had a member from its party elected as president. So when Parliament reopens in February, that president is expected to give SONA, State of the Nation address. Now, these things are not just happening. They are informed by a strategic framework. I think that's the point we tried to make. Now, out of that, we'll have to come, as I say, your 60-month framework, your 5-year framework, which is called the medium-term strategic framework. It's a 5-year perspective. Now, this is an improvement from what used to be ad hoc planning, from what used to be 1-year perspective planning, if you like. And the deliverables or the priorities of the objectives contained in the MTSF would be prioritized in terms of 12 priorities. If you look at the government website, you will see what those 12 outcomes would be. Now, those have to be translated at provincial level. And at provincial level, the head of government will give a state of the province address, then that would be informed by what that province would have crafted as the provincial growth and development strategy. And so that one will cascade into sectoral plans for agriculture, for economic development, for health, for education, and so on. And out of that will be strategic plans. A strategic plan would be a 5-year perspective. Out of the 5-year perspective will be the MTSF, for instance, which gives you the deliverables. Out of the 5-year, rolling out of that would be an MTEF, medium-term expenditure framework, which really says to you, in terms of our strategic framework for this period, we are going to spend as follows in the next 3 years. Rolling out of your MTF would be your APP, annual performance plan. The APP talks to the MTF, MTF talks to the APP. The APP is a 3-year perspective, but principally addresses the year ensuing as well as the latter 2 years. So that gives you your perspective, but we also have municipalities coming up with their strategic plan. They must also take their leave from the national strategic perspective. They will come with strategic service delivery budget plans, IDPs, strategic state spatial development framework, and other sector plans. So in other words, and we know that there are deviations, but in the ideal world, the whole nation at various spheres must strategically speak from one script. That's really what this is saying. Now, from time to time, you see this political leader making a speech, that one is making a speech, and some of us just become punch drunk with all these speeches. But again, these things are not happening haphazardly. They are contained within a particular strategic national consensus, where, for instance, you would have, sorry about that. I've already spoken to the medium-term strategic framework, which is a 5-year perspective, and that emanating from that would be national plans and planning frameworks, and that would be linked to what the President says in the State of the Nation address. You'd also have sectoral strategies. You'll have provincial growth and development strategies that will be linked to the speech we call State of the Province address that the Premier would be giving, strategic plans, annual performance plans, district planning, and planning at local level. So that would be the national framework for strategic planning in the public sector. Now, let us just look at a conceptual perspective of strategic planning in the public sector. Clearly, we all agree that is how the strategic intent is arrived at in terms of vision, mission, and strategic objectives. Then you look at strategy formulation. Now, some of the things that I'm going to say in later slides are really related to the second component around strategy formulation, especially the SWOT. For me, the SWOT is a very, very critical aspect, because when you do your strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats, you have to make sure that the discipline of root cause analysis receives the necessary prominence. Root cause analysis, because once you have done your SWOT and you have understood what your SWOT is really saying, you then have to come up with interventions. And those interventions must be well informed by a thoroughly diagnosed strategic challenge, which you do through your SWOT. And I will talk later about the importance of SWOT, and of course that is followed by strategy implementation and evaluation. and of course your textbook would delineate those three components. What is a strategic plan? By using the example of service delivery there. What in that context is your tactical plan, and what is your operational plan? Again, in other words, whatever activity you see, be it in the corporate world, be it in the public sector, one must be able to understand that within a context. And so you see that would be the context. To make the point once more, things are just not happening haphazardly, but they are contained in a deliberately organized framework of strategy. Again, we see all kinds of things happening around us. And we get confused, we get intellectually constipated, because there is just a lot. There is just a lot impinging on us, and we're trying to make sense of it, and things don't seem to add up. There is a calendar of planning, and that calendar of planning can be accounted for those dates of the calendar year, of the financial year, as depicted there on the screen. Now, when you look at some of these things, and you look at performance in various areas, you say, but these things have been so well crafted. Why do we have so much poverty around us? Some people would say implementation, and implementation, that those are the challenges. But perhaps there are other challenges. The questions that we normally ask in the strategic planning process, the first one is, where are we? And we ask that question in respect of those components. What is our vision right now? Is it an appropriate vision? Are we still married to this vision? What is our mission? And so forth and so on. Now, I have actually indicated that 3 times, but I realize, in other words, where are we? Where do we want to be? In terms of the same framework, how do we get there? There are 2 more questions that I should have included, so if you could please include them. The next question is, how would we know that we have arrived? And that's your question that talks to evaluation. Because you just can't say, where are we and where do we want to be? How do we get there? But you need to ask yourself, how will we know whether or not we have arrived? Because you can't manage that which you don't measure. And so that 4th question helps you to measure that. But the 1st question is, having responded to that question, how would we know whether or not we have arrived? You say, based on that, what do we do? What is our intervention? Because invariably, when you do that, you need to come up with intervention plans. If you research a concept called, what do they call this thing again? Performance model. Your performance model would actually show, will show a complete cycle, closing the loophole, and therefore incorporating all these questions that we ask you. Now, the approach to planning that I've spoken to is fairly new. It's only 9 years old. It was approved in 2010. Why was there a need for a new strategic plan framework? Firstly, there are just so many governments. I mean, if you look at provincial governments, departments, you can easily count about 99. Because on average, every province has 10, 11 departments, and there are 9 provinces, so you have 99. So pre-2010, you had every provincial department, before we even touch national departments, you had every provincial department developing its own strategy. So in other words, the nation was just so haphazard and talking in a very fragmented way. And you could never say, what is the South African nation saying about the future? And therefore, it was very difficult to compare departmental performance, something that is often necessary. The Auditor General of South Africa had difficulty in providing oversight because there's no standard. There's no standard, agreed to standard to measure performance. So that creates difficulty. It was difficult to also establish the levels of planning in government. So these are the challenges, and therefore the reason why we came up with a strategic framework in 2010. So after the introduction of the framework, what results do we see? It's a very important step. It rationalizes, if you like, our planning system. There is standardization, and therefore a common understanding of strategy within the public sector. You see planning, monitoring, reporting, and budgeting also being linked. You would recall that the whole question of PPBS, planning, programming, budgeting system, is something that was also conceived by the Secretary for Defense, Robert McNamara, in the 1960s in the US government. And that robust analytical tool that was initiated there was taken over by the broader US government, used in the oversight system. Congress in the US adopted that system. The usual tension between the executive and the legislative, because Congress at that time felt that if government departments are using this tool, it's going to become very, which is very, very comprehensively technical. It's going to be very difficult for the oversight structures to provide the necessary oversight. So Congress immersed itself very thoroughly in the PPBS system. So that I think one could look at this whole notion of planning, monitoring, reporting, and budgeting as also having a relation to the unfolding processes, which in the short history that we're looking at would be seen to have emanated from Robert McNamara that time. Accountability standards, oversight, and therefore making the work of the Auditor General easier, empowering of departments, enabling departments to be more focused, more robust in their planning systems. But like any system, you would see shortcomings in the new system that was introduced, silent in the following issues. Yes, a department would have its own tool based on the strategic planning framework that was adopted in 2010. But if you look at the Constitution provides for certain functions that have to be delivered, especially social functions that have to be delivered in an intergovernmental framework system. So that when you look at education, the minister at national level as well as the MEC at provincial level have got to work together in those concurrent functions, similarly with health and various other functions. But you may find that if you look at the constitution with a fine comb, the local government is not necessarily free from taking an interest in matters education. So in a number of areas, you would find that, and I think environmental management is a good one, where you find that all three spheres have a direct responsibility in managing the environment. Now, if they have to do that, strategically, what is their responsibility? Strategically, how do they carry out their responsibility? Now, this strategic planning framework has a shortcoming in the sense that it does not provide for integrated planning. We don't have certain programs that have been institutionalized and therefore can be measured through the strategic planning framework. For example, the question of youth has become very, very important these current times, given the high level of unemployment of young people. Now, do you go for a department of young people? Not really. Do you expect every department to have a program that addresses youth matters? Certainly. How do you now, within your strategic plan as a government, then measure the extent to which departments are actually making commitment for this very critical requirement, and how do you measure their performance, so that there is that kind of horizontal and longitudinal collaboration or coordination that is necessary, and you need a strategic framework to measure the performance, results-based methodology, encouragement of evidence-based policy making, planning, and implementation. So these will be the shortcomings. Notwithstanding the shortcomings, let us look at some of the advantages in strategic management within the public sector. Clearly, it is a critical tool that enables management to manage. You can imagine if you didn't have that tool, what challenges there would be. Clearly, as you embark on a course of action, you are able to say this is critical, this still works when you do your review. This works, this doesn't work. Because when you start a strategic planning process, one of the things that are critical to do is to evaluate existing programs. And as you evaluate existing program, your strategic framework enables you to do that. What are the future opportunities and threats? Right? Now, even outside of the public service, outside the public sector, take a corporate that is planning to invest. And as they move on with their plans to invest, the business there has the headlines, our investor confidence is the worst since 1980. It does appear that a shrewd business person will go back to the drawing board, look at the strategic plan, and say, what adjustments do we make? So that future opportunities and threats. And of course, instead of approaching decision-making in a piecemeal, ad hoc fashion, you have a strategic framework that assists your analysis and decision-making processes. And the allocation of resources is also better informed because you're operating within a strategic planning framework. What else do we see? You see setting of direction. I can very well imagine in 1980, when Zimbabwe got independence, what the late president of Zimbabwe, may he so rest in peace, what he might have been pushing for planning in education. I mean, if you look at our debt to GDP ratio, you feel like fainting because it's huge. And that debt to GDP ratio is impacting very negatively on our economy. Because of that high ratio, as we try to spend in terms of capital formation, in terms of basic social delivery, we have to pay our debt first before we do that. And that is a very, very, very scary situation. So the question over time, allocation of resources is very critical. In 2013, I was doing some benchmarking exercise in China. And before I undertook the trip, I was setting up the National School of Government. So I went to China and with my team to look at good practices. And as part of my preparation, I looked at the planning system in China. And I came across reforms of 1985. If you look at the literature, if you just do some search, you would find these reports. So I looked at this reforms of 1985. And when I was in China, I spent most of my time in Shanghai. And it was just mind-boggling to see the connection between what I had read and the developments that were manifest in Shanghai. And you and I know that Chinese are very good at long-term perspective planning. But it also says that you do that within a framework that inter alia informs you about the best and most efficient, most effective allocation of scarce resources. Question of coordination, communication, measuring progress. Organizations become more disciplined, more organized, because they follow strategic management principles. You are able to say, this is the departmental strategic plan, and all of you are members of this department. On the basis of this, each one of you is going to draw an individual performance plan upon which we're going to judge you. So we don't judge your performance in a vacuum. We judge your individual performance in the context of the strategic plan. So clearly, needless to say, if you did not have a strategic plan, it'd be difficult to assess the performance of each individual. And because of your insistence on KPIs that are smart, that your operational efficiency is enhanced. We've spoken about discipline. We've spoken about organization and individual performance, where you act ex ante instead of ex post, because the discipline of strategic planning compels you to be proactive. We've spoken about communication, we've spoken about measuring. Some people would say, hey, it's got to happen now. Stop wasting time with strategic planning. You can imagine the disaster that will result if you did not plan. But at the same time, you know, if you look at water in this province, we are a water scarce province. Now, when we plan for water, we have to look at bulk supplies. We have to look at boreholes as a resource. As we look at boreholes, the resource, sometimes we forget to look at climate change, because if you don't look at climate change, your water table diminishes. You look at all all these things, but do we plan over a period of time when many people don't have access to water, and many of those who have access to water, the water is not drinkable? It's a hazard, it's a threat to human life. So what do? Do you find money quickly and provide water? Or do we say, we have competing priorities, let's factor all these things into a strategic plan? The choices are never easy to make. And whatever you do, you've got to make sure that you are not too much immersed in rigidity, simply because there are tight rules of strategic management that you have to follow. Right, shall we? We continue to discuss disadvantages. If we're talking about education, so many of us have to come to the party. I mean, the constant problem that we have in the province and elsewhere is a question of infrastructure delivery. And when you check performance with regard to infrastructure delivery, the client department and the agent department usually point fingers at each other. So let's look at education. Your strategic objective is to make sure you eliminate pet latrines by such and such a time. You have to eliminate those. Our children are dying in pet latrines. You've got to do that. So you need to invest in infrastructure. You budget for this. At the end of the year, you find that there are even more children who are using pet latrines at school, notwithstanding your decision to provide. When you ask questions, but why are we underperforming? Public Works blames education, education blames Public Works. So that a lot of the delivery that happens requires horizontal as well as vertical collaboration between departments. And you have to do all that within the framework of strategic management. That's the point I'm trying to make. What are the challenges that we see in the public sector? I think we have already made mention of the tools don't really allow us to do integrated planning. We have mentioned about the question of compliance. You know, there are three things that the Auditor General looks at. The Auditor General looks at your annual financial statement, which is an expenditure reflection of your delivery. The Auditor General looks at the extent to which you comply with legislation, in large measure the PFMA. The Auditor General looks at the extent to which you have performed with regard to predetermined strategic objectives, which is the component that is usually referred to as service delivery. Now, what always boggles the mind for me is that you'll see the Auditor General saying, this department has performed very, very well in terms of predetermined objectives. And remember, predetermined objectives talks to service delivery. But when you look at what they have to deliver on the ground, you find a mismatch. And so what the strategic planning framework has done since 2010, it has infused in us a mindset that says An excellent side of delivery is when you get an excellent mark on your annual performance plan from the Auditor General. So, the beneficiary of your effort is the Auditor General and not the people. I think one can be that cynical, so to say. Lack of communication. Do we ever take our APP and go to the communities and say, especially at the end of the year, and say that is what we said to deliver to you communities? This is our annual report at the end of the period. Look how well we have delivered. We don't bother, let alone demonstrating a strong correlation between that which appears in the Auditor General report as well as what is on the ground. So that is lack of communication and feedback. Target setting not informed by challenges on the ground. Many departments don't include outcome indicators. You know, at some stage in my life, I was Director General of the national department that is responsible for training public servants across the country. And now in terms of the PFMA, I was responsible for producing outputs, and the minister was responsible for producing outcomes. That's what the PFMA says. And right from its inception, I've always argued against that. Doesn't make sense. It is artificial to dichotomize the two, for starters. You've got to find a logical connection between the two. And once you appreciate and recognize the logical connection between the two, then your approach to expectations in respect of these two functionaries, I think will necessarily change. And here is my reasoning. You can't separate outcomes from outputs. Because I may, using the example of a training institution, I may say, I set out to deliver so many person training days. These are my indicator performance, key performance indicators. These were my targets. And I have achieved them. But when you look at the capability of the people that I'm supposed to have trained, it continues to be rock bottom. But you actually give me a bonus in terms of my performance. If you don't give the bonus, I'll run to court. And I'll take you to the cleaners because I'll win. Because the terms of engagement are in terms of the outputs, defined as person training days. So many people, I can actually show you the registers, attendance registers. So many people came through my training, and I can show that. But however, if I say to you, yes, you are committing these training days, you must demonstrate to me, give me the logic that that intervention measured through per person training days will actually transform the capability of your participants. And let's measure that. So that becomes a challenge. Poor indicator setting, and I think use my example of training again. Misalignment between evidences and targeted objectives. Again, person training days, and where is the evidence that these people have changed? Because remember, when you train people, you actually have the rare privilege of getting into the cranium of these people and actually twisting their brains around. That's another way of looking at training. You are actually, it's a privilege to influence human behavior. so that it doesn't go in this direction, it goes in that direction. So all of those, all of you who are in the business of training, you must really call yourselves supermen and women. Provided that what you do in practice actually changes the behavior of those people. Right, let's raise a bit of questions about our strategic planning, strategic management framework. Are circumstances in the public service conducive to strategic management? What criteria do we use to appoint people, for instance? And do we use our strategic imperatives and strategic objectives to appoint these people? These are the strategic objectives that I want to achieve, right? And if you look at the book From Good to Great, it says when you appoint these people, they must be the right people, in the right seat, in the right bus, going in the right direction. It's a powerful strategic statement that is being made. But do you actually have that? The other thing is chaos and disorder. Do we want to say that there is sufficient stability in the public service such that we can get the desired level of public service delivery? I think we need to unpack that and check. Yes, from time to time we find ourselves in crisis management. If we are in crisis management, is that compatible or consistent with strategy? You know, in a previous life, I did a case study of the outbreak of foot and mouth disease. And excuse me. And in this case study, it was remarkable to see how this threat, in fact, as soon as there is an outbreak of foot and mouth disease, your export, import performance gets affected. If you're an exporter, for instance, of beef, immediately those countries that you're trading with, they cut you off. And you are required to do certain things about your stock, about the animals. And you've got to show internationally the interventions have actually worked. And in some instances, there was culling of animals. In other instances, they used the method of injection to deal with vaccination, to deal with this. Those, especially in the case that an area farmers, commercial farmers, subsistence farmers, that actually had their animals culled, were actually responding to the call by government and were compensated. What was interesting in this case study, departments actually went to the communities to look at the stock affected, look at the stock culled, and to actually pay in cash. And in the case study, what we illustrate is that not a single rule in PFMA was deviated from. So it was a very unique, very responsive approach to a national crisis. And there was no blockage or impediment posed by the PFMA, despite the fact in some instances they took bags of money and went to pay these farmers. And within no time, because of the joint effort by the nation, coordination vertically and horizontally, we're able to do away with foot and mouth disease. The question is, Why does coordination work so beautifully well in a crisis? Why don't we use the good practices in a crisis so that on a day-to-day basis we're able to run our organizations more efficiently? One reason or the other, we're not getting it. We're not getting it. Question then becomes, this instrument called strategic management, is it amenable to a crisis situation or not? I guess these are the questions that we have to grapple with. Policy and political challenges, invariably complex and intractable, are these consistent with strategic management? Senior managers are generally expected to, or rather find themselves in a situation of what somebody has called chronic ambiguity. What does that mean? When I was heading this department responsible for training, government was really paying salaries only, myself and my staff. The bulk was from funding from the EU, the training programs. Now, here was a challenge. Every October, Reverend Frank Chikani, who was the DG in the presidency, and therefore our first among equals, would require us to produce reports on how we had performed in respect of preferential procurement. The EU, that was funding more than 90% of our programs, said, you dare do it. We take our money and go. We don't want preferential procurement. You do it strictly on merit. So I had two bosses. They want two opposing things. The one wants me to demonstrate preferential procurement. Given where we come from, you know the legitimacy in this policy. The one who has the bag of money says, you don't use my money on preferential procurement. And you've got to satisfy both. So one day we're being addressed by Minister Isopat that time. He was the minister in the presidency. I said, Minister, I've got this dilemma. Every October I've got to account. And I'm trying to find a way of striking a balance between the two. What do you think? This is what I think I should handle it. What do you think? He looked at me and he said, Job, why do you think we appointed you a Director General? Next question. That was the answer he gave me. In other words, what the minister was saying to me, that at your position, at your level, you are necessarily thrust in a situation of chronic ambiguity. Whether you like it or not, you've got to survive. And that is the challenge to leaders in the public sector. Oftentimes, even in the corporate sector, all you have to do is to look at Old Mutual. I'm sure the leaders of Old Mutual have committed themselves to the Constitution. But every time Moyo wins a court case and he goes back to work, they say the gates are going to be shut. And you say, but how do you live in that kind of contradiction? Now, many decision makers know that they operate in a VUCA world. Now, we all know what a VUCA world is. VUCA, the first V stands for volatile. U stands for uncertainty. C, complexity. Ambiguity, A. That is an acronym that aptly describes the environment that you and I operate within. And therefore, the question is, if you live in an environment that is volatile, that is ambiguous, that is complex, that is uncertain, does strategic management and the tools thereof apply in a VUCA world? The chances are it's difficult to apply them in a VUCA world. Now, it is clearly the order in which we live in, or the disorder in which we live in. It has massive uncertainties, as VUCA suggests, volatility and unpredictable consequences. So how do we do business in such a world? How do we do business in such a world? Do strategy makers actually misalign their internal decisions to address these volatilities in the environment? We know that the doctrines of strategic management assume a world of equilibrium. So how then do we apply these strategic management tools? I think that's a question we are asking them. Whether we like it or not, our strategic management tools are based on a framework that shows we know the problems, we understand the origin of our problems, we have the necessary knowledge to solve our problems, we have the necessary expertise, we have the necessary mathematical models to use. Perhaps the reality is, in a VUCA world, that can never be so. So, do we have a capability of adjusting the way we do things, the way we implement, we manage strategy? Do we make the necessary adjustments to a VUCA world? And maybe here is one example in which, as we implement tools of strategic management, we make the necessary adjustments so that we can do that. And these are some of the things that are very key, in my view, for leadership development. Because here is the reality of the VUCA world. If we just define that reality in terms of complexity, the first type of complexity is called dynamic complexity. In dynamic complexity, as you implement strategy, you'll be confronted with, when you do your SWOT analysis now, let's refer back to SWOT. You'll find that some of the issues, when you do your analysis of problems, as part of dynamic complexity, which basically means cause and effect are separate or separated in time and space. Let's look at space as an example. A very good example, we being a country that relies heavily on minerals. When our minerals are bought by outside countries, our balance of payments improves. Our economic performance improves. Because their appetite, China for instance, is one consumer. Their appetite has risen for our minerals. When their appetite for one economic reason or the other goes down, we suffer. The price of platinum goes down, the price of gold goes down, and so forth and so on. So when we are sitting here grappling with resolving questions of economic growth and development in the Northwest, with an effort amongst others to create jobs, when you sit here on your strategic management, you must know that some of the issues that you are managing are of a dynamic complexity nature. So China is actually influencing your management, whether you like it or not. It's also an example of globalization. So that's an example of space. Another example of dynamic complexity is where cause and effect are separate in terms of time. So, There is a place in Taung where people were forcibly removed in 1993 so that the then rulers of government could build a dam. The people were forcibly removed in this area to the west of the province. If I go to that's 1993, before democracy. If I go to the legislature and the members of parliament ask me about compensation of those people, I cannot say, no, it's Mr. Mangope who did that. No, I've taken responsibility. So I'm managing a dynamic complexity of an issue where cause and effect are separate in terms of time. It becomes my responsibility. Another type of complexity is social complexity, where all of us come to solve a very difficult problem. All of us are gathered here to solve a difficult problem. Each one of you has a different way of approaching the problem. There is nobody who is right or wrong. There is nobody who is relevant or irrelevant. We must take account of all the views that you express, so that when you implement strategy and you are confronted with that kind of challenge, bear in mind that at some point, when you look at the things that you have to put in your strategic plan, get the views of everybody, whether you agree with those views or not. And ultimately, another type of dynamic complexity is called generative complexity. Some of the things that you are going to manage in your strategic plan, you don't know what causes them, nor do you know what the solution is. And that's the reality. Now, the further reality of life is a coexistence where the circles actually overlap, the common point of overlap. Some of them would have features of dynamic complexity. The same problems would have elements of social complexity. The same problems would also have elements of generative complexity. And it really becomes something very difficult to manage. But that's the reality of the world within which we manage. I don't know how I'm doing on time. Please give me some warning signal.
Time to wrap up.
Okay, time to wrap up. Basically, what I'm doing here is just to list the factors that affect our ability to think, plan, and manage strategically. Because you could have your strategic plan, and I, as your political principal, go to do constituency work over the weekend. Monday, I call you in and I say, hey, people don't have water there. People don't have roads there. The accidents are just unbelievable. Do something about it. Now, you can either say to me, it is not in our strategic plan, we have not budgeted for it, we are going to get into trouble with PFMA, or you can find a way of maneuvering, but still staying within the law. I think that's what happens to a senior public servant on a daily basis. Pressure from special interest groups, those happen on a daily basis. Intergovernmental responsibility, media would also put pressure on us, whether you like it or not. Fragmented, disorderly management practices, and so on. I deal with instances where strategic planning is not advisable. And here's an example. Sometimes you are just about to appoint a director general or an HOD. Is it wise to proceed with strategic plan? Well, that person owns the product. I think that's what we're trying to say. Here I'm just talking about strategic capability. And I think basically in the short time available, we've obviously spoken about the challenges and the realities of the South African public sector. We have spoken about the realities of the complex and chaotic environment, and we have defined this as a VUCA world, and that we need to make sure that in developing our leaders, in appointing our leaders, that we take stock of and we are sensitive to these realities. As you can see, I'm just being stopped. And as a law-abiding citizen, I will comply.
Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot. Thank you.
We do have time for one or two questions if anybody has a question. But I would just like to make this comment, Premier. During this week, we had a media clown claiming to have taught at WITS. At least, if you were ever to make the claim that you have taught at Northwest, we will confirm and endorse. I've got just one small question out of the world that I'm operating in. In that sketch you had about the interaction of the different plans and where policy comes from and where party political programs are, how do you deal with a document that National Treasury issued a week or two ago proposing changes to policy? Where does that thing fit in your whole scheme of things? Because we had interesting reactions on it. I don't want you to declare whether you like it or not, just the process part of that document.
When you look at the stakeholders, the kind of voices that we heard from stakeholders, some of them were very loud, some of them were very constructively aggressive, and in in the spirit of democracy, you may want to ask my colleague MEC for health to just give a view, just to hear a different voice, with due respect.
Yeah, you're welcome, if you want to answer.
So I don't say my view on the document.
No, all I want to know is process-wise.
Okay.
Economic policy document.
Process-wise, National Treasury has some responsibility to develop economic policies. In the process of government, if it were to be purely a government policy, it would have to be developed by National Treasury and in consultation with the economic cluster. We consulted the economic cluster in government. The economic cluster, having spoken on the document, would have to then consult the economic subcommittee of the ruling party.
Okay, that's where the link then.
That's where the link is. Now the economic subcommittee then expands the consultation to include your broader alliance partners, other research institutions that may have an input on an economic policy, which necessarily can't have in a cabinet policy before it goes outside. So the arguments were on the basis that this component of a subcommittee may have been ignored.
Okay.
And remember, the general argument has been that government has taken over policy formulation away from the processes of a ruling party to government processes, where policies are only consulted internally in government. Government internal process is not that problematic on the document. The problem is that they have been consulted with the economic cluster of government. You therefore have to go and consult the economic subcommittee, which then opens up internally first before it goes outside.
No, but what complicated the issue, of course, was the man that I gave his own name, Tito Mboweni. I'm referring to him as the voorhamer van Magubas Kloof, and the way in which he announced it. But thank you for that answer. And we've got one last little item. One of the students will just give a gift of appreciation to the Premier for taking time out for this lecture. We thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I think if I may, what this illustrates, what this question illustrates, is that you need criteria to exist, coexist. You need efficiency, effectiveness, and economy to coexist. Now, Minister Tito Mboweni, looking at the state of the economy, may think that the prominence of efficiency must dominate. But then the effectiveness of the policy process suffers terribly, precisely because there's not been a consultative process. And I think in the facilitation I've done here, one of the things that I've highlighted is that in this kind of VUCA world, to what extent do principles of strategic management really apply? I think everybody is panicking given the state of our economy. And almost as a knee-jerk reaction, we would say, oh, at last somebody is coming up with the way forward. And once you get that kind of relief, then various parts of the population say, no, this is nonsense. This is not your policy. It's the nation's policy. And there are processes that we have to follow.
Thank you very much. And I would like you to remember one word out of everything you said today. That's chronic ambiguity. That was a good one. Anthea, please. From one of the students, a little gift, and that's our appreciation for giving us this lecture.
Thank you very much. Sure. Nothing to declare.
No.
Thank you.